The polar vortex has collapsed, and across the eastern United States, the consequences are turning deadly. Right now, wind chills are plunging to 30 degrees below zero. More than 400,000 customers are without power. Airports are paralyzed. Hospitals are overwhelmed. And officials confirm that over 100 people have already lost their lives in the aftermath of back-to-back winter storms. This is not a storm that has passed. This is a pattern that has locked into place. Meteorologists are calling the current situation one of the most expansive and severe winter weather emergencies in recent American history. Entire regions from the southeast to the northeast are facing a convergence of disasters. At the same time, extreme cold, widespread power failures, transportation collapse, and mounting human casualties. In North Carolina alone, icy roads triggered more than 750 crashes in just 18 hours, including a 100-vehicle pileup on Interstate 85 that trapped drivers for hours in freezing conditions. Across the East Coast, thousands of flights were cancelled, stranding travelers as temperatures dropped fast enough to cause frostbite within minutes. And yet forecasters are warning that the most dangerous phase may not be over. A brief warm-up is possible in the coming days, but meteorologists caution that it may only be a pause, a short window, before another surge of Arctic air crashes south, bringing renewed snow, ice, and bitter cold with it. So the question now is not just what happened, it's what happens next, and whether the warnings came soon enough to save lives. Two powerful systems, Winter Storm Fern, followed closely by Winter Storm Gianna, have combined into one of the deadliest winter weather periods the United States has seen in decades. Officials now confirm that the combined death toll has surpassed 100, with fatalities reported across multiple states from the southeast to the northeast. More than 400,000 homes and businesses remain without electricity, even after utility crews restored power to hundreds of thousands of customers. At the peak of the outages, over 1 million people were left in the dark as ice and heavy snow snapped power lines and collapsed trees across entire regions. Transportation systems failed almost simultaneously. Flight tracking services recorded more than 2,800 cancellations in a single day, with major hubs like Charlotte, Atlanta, Philadelphia, and New York grinding to a halt. Amtrak suspended multiple rail routes, while highways across the Carolinas, Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee became impassable under snow and ice. Hospitals and emergency services were pushed to their limits. Emergency rooms treated frostbite cases within minutes of exposure, while paramedics responded to crashes, falls, and medical emergencies caused by prolonged sub-freezing temperatures. In some areas, blocked roads, delayed ambulances, and prevented patients from reaching care in time. Schools closed across dozens of districts, not just for a day but for extended periods as snow and ice remained locked in place by relentless cold. Warming centers opened in major cities, while shelters filled with residents who could no longer heat their homes safely. This was not a single storm, leaving isolated damage behind. It was a system-wide failure under extreme conditions, unfolding across millions of lives at the same time, and raising urgent questions about how prepared communities truly were for cold of this magnitude. What scientists can confirm so far paints a clear and troubling picture. Winter Storm Gianna developed as a bomb cyclone off the East Coast around January 30th, a process defined by an extremely rapid drop in atmospheric pressure, at least 24 millibars, within 24 hours. In Gianna's case, that threshold was met as central pressure plunged and wind gusts approached 60 miles per hour, intensifying the storm at a critical moment. Unlike many winter systems that focus their impact on a single region, Gianna stretched across an unusually large area. Satellite imagery showed a continuous band of snow and ice extending from the Georgia coastline through the Carolinas, up the mid-Atlantic, and into New England. Snowfall totals exceeded historical averages in multiple locations, with parts of North Carolina reporting more than 16 inches of accumulation in less than 24 hours. Behind the storm, a far more dangerous atmospheric shift took place. A confirmed stratospheric warming event disrupted the polar vortex, a normally stable circulation of frigid air locked over the Arctic. When this circulation weakened and collapsed, the cold air escaped southward. As a result, temperature anomalies of 30 degrees below seasonal norms spread across much of the eastern United States. The National Weather Service documented wind chills between -10 and -25 degrees Fahrenheit across major population centers, including New York City, Philadelphia, and Boston, with even colder conditions in higher Elevations. These values are not just uncomfortable, they are medically dangerous, capable of causing frostbite in minutes. Power grids and infrastructure struggled under the combined strain of ice accumulation, extreme cold, and sustained demand for heating. Ice loading snapped trees and power lines, contributing to outages that left hundreds of thousands without electricity for extended periods. Meteorological models agree on one critical point: this pattern is not random. The deformation of the polar vortex has established a persistent cold regime supporting repeated intrusions of Arctic air rather than a single short-lived blast. These facts are not projections or speculation. They are confirmed observations, the foundation for understanding why this winter emergency has escalated so quickly and why forecasters are watching the days ahead with growing concern. Despite the growing body of confirmed data, some of the most critical questions remain unanswered. Meteorologists can identify the collapse of the polar vortex and track the current surge of Arctic air, but they cannot yet say how quickly the system will recover. In past events, the polar vortex has reformed within weeks. In others, it has remained distorted long enough to fuel multiple waves of extreme cold well beyond initial forecasts. That uncertainty is now the central concern. Long-range models suggest a brief moderation in temperatures, with some regions potentially warming into the 30s for a few days. But forecasters caution that this does not signal a return to normal. Instead, it may represent a temporary pause, a narrow window before additional Arctic air masses unlock and move south again, renewing the threat of snow, ice, and dangerous cold. Another unresolved issue is how storms will interact with the entrenched cold air. Even modest systems can become high-impact events when ground temperatures remain well below freezing. Snowfall that would normally melt can accumulate rapidly, while freezing rain can cripple power infrastructure already weakened by previous storms. There is also uncertainty in how accurately models are capturing the extent and duration of sub-freezing temperatures. Small errors in temperature forecasts can mean the difference between rain and ice, or between manageable snowfall and widespread transportation failure. Perhaps most concerning is the human factor. Forecasts can describe risk, but they cannot fully account for fatigue, delayed response, or public perception after consecutive disasters. As conditions persist, compliance with travel advisories and safety warnings often declines, even as the danger remains high. What scientists know is substantial. What they don't know may prove just as important. The threat is no longer defined by a single storm or a single forecast window. It is defined by a volatile pattern, one capable of producing repeated disruptions with little recovery time in between. And until the polar vortex stabilizes, the risk remains open-ended. What happens next will depend on a fragile balance between atmospheric recovery and continued instability. Meteorologists are now watching several key indicators that will determine whether this crisis escalates or slowly unwinds. The first is the behavior of the upper-level jet stream. Right now, it remains highly amplified, allowing Arctic air to plunge south while steering storm systems directly into the eastern United States. Until that jet stream flattens the door to extreme cold remains open. The second indicator is stratospheric recovery. Scientists monitor temperatures high above the Arctic to see whether the polar vortex begins to reassemble into a stable circular pattern. As long as it remains stretched and fragmented, cold air reservoirs can continue leaking southward in waves rather than all at once. The third risk factor is storm timing. Forecast models show multiple disturbances lining up over the Pacific and Gulf regions. If even one of these systems phases correctly with entrenched cold air, it could produce another major winter storm, potentially rivaling or exceeding the impacts of Gianna in specific regions. Emergency managers are also tracking infrastructure resilience. Power grids stressed by ice loading, repeated outages, and sustained heating demand remain vulnerable. Transportation networks already disrupted by snow and freezing temperatures may struggle to recover before the next system arrives. Each additional storm compounds damage and slows response times. For the public, the guidance remains clear but urgent. This is not the moment to relax precautions. Officials continue to warn that the most dangerous phase of prolonged winter emergencies often comes after the headlines fade, when exhaustion sets in and people begin to underestimate lingering risks. The science does not point to an immediate end. It points to a pattern, one that favors repeated cold intrusions, additional snowfall opportunities, and ongoing hazards well into mid-February and possibly beyond. Until atmospheric signals clearly shift, the threat remains active. This is no longer about a single storm. It is about endurance in a winter that is still unfolding. As the immediate danger slowly gives way to recovery, a harder question begins to surface. Were we ready for this kind of winter? Winter storm Gianna did not arrive without warning. The signals were present days, even weeks in advance. Forecast models flagged the stratospheric warming event. Long-range outlooks hinted at a destabilized polar vortex. Yet for many communities, the severity still came as a shock. One critical issue now under review is communication. While technical warnings were issued, many residents report they did not fully grasp the scale or duration of the threat. Terms like dangerous, cold, and major winter storm failed to convey what prolonged power outages, impassable roads, and lethal wind chills would actually mean in daily life. Another vulnerability lies in infrastructure preparedness. Power grids across multiple states proved highly sensitive to ice accumulation. Tree trimming backlogs, aging transmission lines, and limited redundancy turned a weather event into a cascading systems failure. Once electricity went down, heating systems followed, and medical emergencies surged. Transportation decisions are also under scrutiny. The 100-vehicle pileup on Interstate 85 has raised serious questions about road closure thresholds and commercial traffic restrictions during rapidly deteriorating conditions. Minutes mattered. Decisions delayed by even an hour had irreversible consequences. Emergency response agencies worked relentlessly, but many were stretched thin by the geographic scale of the disaster. When storms impact multiple states simultaneously, mutual aid becomes harder to deploy. Resources that might have filled gaps simply were not available. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is this: extreme winter events are no longer rare anomalies. They are becoming longer, more complex, and more disruptive. Planning based on historical averages is no longer enough. Gianna exposed the cost of hesitation not just in dollars, but in lives. The challenge now is whether those lessons will translate into stronger systems, clearer warnings, and faster action before the next storm arrives. Because the pattern that produced this disaster is not gone, and winter for much of the country is far from over. While recovery efforts continue across the eastern United States, meteorologists are already looking forward, and what they see is deeply unsettling. The atmospheric pattern that fueled Winter Storm Gianna has not reset. It has merely shifted. Long-range ensemble models from both the GFS and ECMWF now show a persistent trough developing over the western United States. On its own, that feature would be unremarkable. But paired with lingering Arctic air locked over the central and eastern regions, it creates a volatile setup, one capable of producing multiple high-impact winter systems in rapid succession. In practical terms, this means brief warm-ups followed by sharp temperature crashes, snow turning to ice, rain freezing on contact, and repeated stress on infrastructure that has already been pushed to its limits. Forecasters are particularly concerned about storm timing. Several potential systems are projected to track through the Midwest, Ohio, Valley, Mid-Atlantic, and Northeast over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Individually, none may match Gianna's peak intensity, but cumulatively, they could be just as dangerous. Ice accumulation remains a primary threat. Even a quarter-inch of ice is enough to down trees and power lines. After Gianna, many regions still have weakened vegetation and damaged infrastructure. The margin for failure is now far smaller than it was before the storm. Another growing concern is human fatigue. Emergency responders, utility crews, medical staff, and local governments are operating under sustained strain. As events stack closer together, response times slow, resources thin, and mistakes become more likely. Meteorologists stress that uncertainty remains. Forecast tracks will shift, intensities will change, but the pattern itself is robust. The atmosphere is primed for additional disruptions, not a return to calm. This is why officials urge communities not to treat Gianna as a closed chapter. Preparation now matters more than ever. Backup heating plans, charged devices, stock supplies, clear communication channels. Checking on vulnerable neighbors before, not after the next alert. The science is clear this winter is operating under a different set of rules. What once happened once a decade can now happen multiple times in a single season. Gianna was not the end of the story. It was a warning shot, and the atmosphere is still writing the next chapter. As Winter Storm Gianna fades from headlines, its consequences remain etched across communities from the southeast to New England. Power is still being restored. Roads are still being cleared. Families are still counting losses that numbers alone cannot capture. But the most important question now is not what happened, it is what happens next. Extreme cold is not just uncomfortable, it is lethal. Frostbite does not wait. Hypothermia does not announce itself. Carbon monoxide does not give second chances. Gianna demonstrated how quickly routine life can collapse when systems fail simultaneously: power, transportation, healthcare, and communication. Emergency officials continue to stress a simple reality: individual decisions matter. Staying off the roads, using generators correctly, checking weather updates from official sources, reaching out to elderly neighbors. These actions, repeated thousands of times, can mean the difference between a crisis managed and a tragedy multiplied. At the same time, responsibility does not rest on individuals alone. Governments, utilities, and planners face hard questions: how warnings are framed, when roads are closed, where shelters are placed, how infrastructure is hardened for conditions that are no longer rare. Gianna exposed a gap between scientific knowledge and public understanding. The data existed, the models warned of danger, yet too many people were caught unprepared for the severity and duration of what followed. This storm was not an anomaly. It was part of a broader shift toward longer, colder, more destructive winter events driven by an unstable climate system. Treating it as a once-in-a-generation disaster risks repeating the same mistakes. The warning is already written in ice, snow, and silence. Preparation is not panic. Caution is not fear. Winter is not finished. And the next decision, by officials, by communities, by individuals, will determine whether Gianna becomes a turning point or a preview. Winter storm Gianna did not arrive in isolation. It emerged from a larger atmospheric pattern that scientists have been tracking for years, and that pattern is still active. Meteorological models now show a recurring setup: weakened polar circulation, amplified jet stream waves, and repeated intrusions of Arctic air into the eastern United States. When these elements align, cold does not simply arrive and leave. It locks in, feeding multiple storms, prolonging outages, and exhausting response systems already stretched thin. What makes this pattern especially dangerous is its persistence. Brief warm-ups create a false sense of relief, only to be followed by renewed cold ice and snow. Infrastructure weakened by the first wave often fails during the second. Emergency shelters fill faster. Power crews fall behind. Hospitals face compounding strain. Long-range guidance from both the European and GFS models suggests that this cycle is far from over. Additional winter systems remain possible well into February, with another storm window opening in the coming days. While exact tracks will shift, the background risk remains elevated. This is the uncomfortable truth. Scientists are emphasizing the baseline has changed. Conditions that once required rare alignment are becoming easier to achieve. Warmer oceans supply more moisture. Disrupted stratospheric circulation allows cold air to plunge farther south. The result is not just stronger storms, but more complex, overlapping disasters. Gianna showed how quickly small failures cascade. A radar goes offline. A road remains open too long. A warning is misunderstood. None of these alone cause catastrophe. Together they do. The lesson is not to fear winter, it is to respect it in its new form. Preparation must extend beyond a single forecast. Planning must assume repetition, not rarity. Because the question facing communities is no longer if another storm will come, but whether the next one will find us any better prepared than the last. When the snow finally melts and the power comes back on, what remains is not just damage, it is reckoning. Winter Storm Gianna will be remembered not only for its numbers, but for what those numbers represent. 100 lives lost, hundreds of thousands without power, transportation networks frozen, hospitals overwhelmed, entire regions forced into survival mode by cold that arrived faster, stayed longer, and cut deeper than expected. Yet Gianna did not break the system all at once. It revealed where the system was already fragile. Warnings were issued but not always understood. Infrastructure existed but not always reinforced. Emergency plans were written but not always tested against a storm of this duration and scale. Each gap on its own seemed manageable. Together, they formed a chain reaction. For scientists, Gianna becomes a data point, a case study in how atmospheric instability translates into human cost. For emergency planners, it becomes a benchmark. The storm future plans must now be built around. For families who lost loved ones, it becomes something far more personal. The uncomfortable truth is that no single decision caused this disaster, and no single fix will prevent the next one. What Gianna leaves behind is a choice. To treat this storm as an exception or as evidence, to rebuild systems for yesterday's climate or tomorrow's, to wait for certainty or act on warning. Winter is changing. The atmosphere is less predictable, and the margin for error is shrinking. Gianna has already passed. But the question it leaves us with is still very much alive. When the next storm arrives, will we respond differently or repeat the same mistakes under a different name? If you want to stay ahead of events like this, not with rumors, not with panic, but with verified data and clear analysis, make sure you're subscribed. This channel follows developing weather and disaster patterns in real time, breaking down what we know, what we don't know, and why it matters. When conditions change, when risks escalate, and when official guidance shifts, you'll hear it here clearly, responsibly, and without exaggeration. These stories don't end when headlines fade. The next system is already forming somewhere, and preparation starts with information. Subscribing ensures you don't miss critical updates, detailed forecasts, and in-depth breakdowns designed to help you understand what's coming and how to respond. If this analysis helped you, share it with someone who might need it. Stay informed, stay prepared, and subscribe so you're ready before the next warning arrives.